good evening, everybody. I think the moment has come. Welcome to everybody that's in the room and also to everybody that's listening online. And of course, now we say for those of you that are listening on catch up. My name's Jenny Hyam. I'm the Vice Chancellor here at St George's, and it's yet another very happy occasion. But I'll be honest with you, I didn't think we were ever going to get here. Charlotte has been rearranged on no less than 2 former occasions, but finally we've come to tonight. And what a great title. She's noisy. Well, of course, that's a tiny aspect of what we're going to hear about. In fact, what we're going to hear about, as is characteristic of an inaugural, is a career that's based around the study of a variety of environmental concerns, but noise being a very important one and one that is often overlooked. Charlotte has been a fantastic recruit for us, and I will say that we had some members, internal and external members at council level, and a small hand-picked number of professors came to give their very long elevator pitch, and at the end of it they were just spellbound by what you had to say. So, and our gain, you coming here and having the chair, is other people's loss. So you came to us, and as part of that we gave you this chair, and we're very proud of everything that you've achieved. So without further ado, we're going to hear the lecture, which is going to cover your career. Very importantly, thereafter, we're not going to ask any questions. If you want to ask questions, you have to do the next thing, which is join us for a drink and nibbles, which are just literally next door and nearby. There will be a vote of thanks by John Friedland, who again will remind you of that. And apologies, those of you online, you'll just have to arrange your own glass. Thank you very much, Charlotte.
Thank you, Jenny, and thank you everyone for coming along, and those who are here in person and online. I was saying, whilst I might like going to parties, I would never arrange a party for fear that people wouldn't come along. So I'm very grateful. So I'm going to talk about what to me seems like that, but is actually 20 years of my life, and it's quite staggering when I think about it. I've actually had this huge passion for noise and health research for all that time, and I'm still not bored of it. So what's the problem that I really deal with? Well, as a social scientist, most of you might not know that I'm actually a psychologist, so a secret social scientist. And, you know, we like asking you questions, so I thought I would start with a question. So what I want you to do is to think, the question is, thinking about the last 12 months or so when you're at home, how much does noise from road traffic bother, disturb or annoy you? And you have 5 options, and you should just go with the first one that you saw that looks like you. Okay. And, you know, this is classic social science. If I told you how many hours have gone into crafting this question, you would die of it. But what we do with this question is an international standard. And actually, how many people here said very or extremely? Anyone? Few people, not very many. But what we do is, if you would have said those, we would consider that you are highly annoyed. And you're going to hear this term all through this talk. Being annoyed is a health outcome for us in noise and health, and it's actually one that really drives the policy that we set in the UK very often. And so I'll show this to you first, because I'm not supposed to influence you before you see this question and answer it. But really, the problems that we deal with in this field generally are to do with transportation noise. So things like railway noise, aircraft noise, wind turbines, roads. Most of the population will be exposed to some road traffic noise. The other sources are less common. And so this is quite a tricky slide, because I've got many people here from the Institute of Acoustics. I've even got a few former people who have led the Institute of Acoustics. And then I've got people who wouldn't know how noise was measured at all. So noise, how does sound become noise? Well, that's just up to you. If you like it, you'll probably say it's a sound. If you don't like it, you'll say it's a terrible noise. So it's really just subjective. We tend to use the term noise in our field rather than sound, and perhaps sometimes incorrectly. But this is just an example showing you on decibels, which is the metric we use, a range of noise exposures that you can have for different items in your environment. So you can see right down at the bottom there is the threshold of hearing. They've put here as 0. And then through to things like a passenger car, which is around 70, rain is around 50, and right up to things that you wouldn't want to hear, like a plane. You wouldn't want to hear an aircraft taking off at 120 decibels. And 2 things to think about with decibels is that it's not a linear scale, which can make it quite difficult for people to understand. And this example here from Thomas Munzel, he's indicated there that 55 level is an important level, and in the EU that is set as a level where health effects have become important or are important. But actually we're thinking now that that's, I don't think we'd all put that on our charts like this anymore. We're thinking that effects happen a lot lower. And of course, the other thing to think about is that your attitude to the source is not only about the decibels. So rain is at 50, you might like that, but if you had car traffic at that level, you might not like that so much. So it's not all about the actual physical sounds from these items. So this is a bit of a busy slide, but I'll talk you through it. And I have to thank John Gulliver for this. This is from some pilot work that we've done for a bid that we're currently putting together. So how do I decide how much noise you're exposed to? It's quite a tricky thing. What we tend to do is that we will think about you in your home. That's why that question earlier asked you about your home. And we also we characterize or model your noise exposure over an annual period. So noise doesn't change that much day to day, and we will give you an annual exposure for your house, or as John keeps telling me, these are postcodes. So on the left hand side, this is for a population of 2.5 million in Manchester, so around 60,000 postcodes. And on the left, we have your daytime exposure. So that's a classic metric that we use, is how much noise is there at your home between 7 AM and that's 7 o'clock at night. And then we've got L night, which is night time from 11 o'clock at night through to 7 o'clock in the morning. And I'm just showing you this, we show you the whole range of noise exposures you get over that time. So we tend to model from sort of around 45 decibels up to over 65. And this is really great data because John doesn't only model the major roads, he's got great models that do all the minor roads, which is really important for our sort of health studies, because you're getting much better exposure estimate for individuals at their home. And then along the bottom is just to show you the distribution in the population, and that actually quite a lot of us have, you know, quite a big exposure, but actually there's a good range there within the population. I think it's quite tempting for people to think most people don't have a big dose of noise, but actually it is quite well spread across the general population. So that's how we estimate the environmental noise. I make it sound really easy, don't I? Like you just went whoop. We've got that. And then just another couple of things on that is that it's really important to realise there's no limit values for environmental noise, and this can leave the public quite unprotected or feeling vulnerable that there isn't a dead set limit above which they won't be exposed. And I know often from presenting this in the Institute, people get all keen on their own exposure. So noise isn't modelled nationally for all of you, but if you lived in a town with more than 200,000 people, or on a major A road, you can look up your exposure on this link. And actually, if you just search for DEFRA noise maps, it should come up, and you'll get your road, air, rail noise for day and night time periods for those of you who are curious. So that's the exposure. So in terms of the health outcomes, the one I mentioned to you earlier was being highly annoyed. So within noise and health, we're obsessed with these, what we call exposure response relationships. So along the bottom, we'll have a noise exposure. This is an average for day, evening and night time, ranging from 55 to 75. And then up on the other axis is what percentage of the population would say they were highly annoyed. So that's that question from the beginning. And this is quite old data, but it shows you the response you get for aircraft in pink, road traffic in turquoise, and then rail in blue. And the reason I put up this data, which is older, because actually the newer data would show even stronger relationships, is that it shows you that, for example, at 60 decibels, you don't get the same response for different noise sources. So aircraft noise usually comes out as being more annoying at 60 decibel. You'll get more of your population being annoyed. Then it's usually road traffic, and then it's railway traffic. And this is just because it's not all about the noise. There's a whole perception about the noise and how you might respond to it, how you might feel about the person who's making that noise, and your own situational factors. And so this is probably my most technical slide, so bear with me. So I really thought this was a good opportunity. When I started out in noise, which I'm going to tell you how I started in a minute, people, I think I shouldn't use the term, but they thought you were slightly mad when you suggested that noise might influence your health. There was a lot of skepticism and disbelief, really. And I think the good thing that's happened in 20 years is that that has gone away, most definitely. And so there's now been enough studies where we can combine similar studies. So we combine the results of lots of studies to show effects. And so here I've just got, this is your risk of having a sort of an adverse or poorer health if you've got 10 decibel difference in your noise exposure. And so the top, the pink, this is from a really nice recent review by Mike Smith and co, showing that you're twice as likely to have sleep disturbance for a 10 decibel increase in your noise. And that's for aircraft and rail. The blue shows you heart disease, and we find for heart disease, and also the turquoise is stroke, we find small but consistent effects of having the road or aircraft noise exposure to those sources. And a 10 decibel change in your increase in your noise will cause around a sort of a 5 to 8% increase in your risk of having those quite serious health outcomes. Similar for depression. We also find it for poorer reading. And then, as you can see, the biggest effect is always seen for annoyance, which is the biggest health effect. And that's why we do consider that quite an important health outcome, a stress response really to the situation in which you're living. And so just continuing on how noise influences biology. So it's clear it makes you annoyed, can disturb your activities. We know, I'll come on to learning, causes stress response, influences quality of life, your mental health and well-being. It also disturbs your sleep. And so it can cause you to wake up, give you poor sleep quality. We all know if we don't sleep well, we're in a bad mood the next day. That's not good for your health either. And altogether, these cause biological responses. So you get stress hormones. If you're exposed for a long time, you get stress hormones released. You also get an increase in a whole range of cardiovascular risk factors, things like blood pressure, lipids. And over time, that can lead to oxidative stress and inflammation. And then over time, you're into this blue circle here of where really things you don't want probably to happen to you start to happen. So you get hypertension, which is high blood pressure, heart attacks, heart disease, strokes, type 2 diabetes, and effects have also started now to be shown for dementia, and there's also evidence for premature mortality. But it's important to realise this happens over a long part of your life course. This takes probably at least 20 years, we think, before you start to get those negative health outcomes. And so just to give you an idea of the burden of disease, this is based on the environmental noise data that Hilary at DEFRA has to manage. It all goes into Europe and we get these figures out. And they set this level of 55 decibels on a day, evening, night. And in the UK, we have 9.5 million people exposed to road traffic at that level, 1.2 at rail, 1 million for aircraft, and about 120,000 for industrial noise. And as you can see, that means each year we've got 1,000 premature deaths, around 6,000 new cases of heart disease, 750,000 suffering sleep disturbance, and 2.5 million suffering from annoyance. And we're not very good. We haven't yet got, I think, hopefully people in the audience agree, good at the cost benefits of all these health impacts and what they cost society. But Ben always reminds me that the annual social cost of urban road noise in England, that's just England, is 7 to 10 billion. And remember, we think these are quite high thresholds. So actually we're probably, well, not probably, we're underestimating the burden of disease because we're not actually counting everybody in. So that's Noise 101. And apologies to those with technical experience who could have done that better than me. But the key question is, how did I become noisy? So if my brother were here today, he would say I've been noisy for a lot longer than 20 years. But noise and health really is my big passion. And I was working at Surrey. I did my degree and my PhD at Surrey, and I was there as a postdoc. And then I saw this advert in jobs.ac.uk to go and work on a noise and health study at Barts. And I was very tempted and I applied. And I'd say I was lucky because my whole career came from this section. So I've even found the letter. And it's very fuzzy because everything in 2002 was really fuzzy. Okay. So this is a picture of the first meeting of Ranch, and I didn't work on Ranch at this point, but I don't have many Ranch photos. And I was interviewed, and Stephen Stansfeld wrote me this lovely letter that I was going to come and join them and work on Ranch. And I was also going to work on Relax, which was an adolescent cohort study looking at mental health. And that was a really nice experience on that study too. And there's a really funny bit in this letter that says personnel will be in touch, but it might take a bit of time. I'm not going to comment on whether that still might be the case in academic settings. So I really landed on my feet because I got this job as a research fellow. I was really passionate about the topic. They'd collected all the data and I came in when all the data was being collated. And there's people in this picture now today who I still work with, which shows you what a great study it was to work on. And the best bit of this whole experience was that I got to work with Stephen. And Stephen and I worked together for nearly 15 years. And he was just the best boss. He was amazing to work for. This is a picture of Stephen getting his lifetime award from the Noise Abatement Society with his wife Jenny and Lisa, who was your PA. And it was just a really fun time. And working with Stephen, he always gave me opportunities. He always networked me. He paid for me to travel around the world several times, so he's responsible for all my carbon footprint. And it was just really good. I really loved working with Stephen. And when Stephen retired, it was really a very sad time because I knew things were going to change. And I really did just love working with Stephen. And so what did I do? Well, the main thing that we were working on was Ranch. And the key question there was whether children attending noisy schools had poorer learning and health. And so Stephen had done 2 previous studies around Heathrow looking at aircraft noise and children's learning. And then he'd gone to the EU to get money to do a study that went across the Netherlands and Spain. So we all collected the same data. And we ended up with data from over 2,000 children from schools around Heathrow, Amsterdam Schiphol and Madrid airports. And so I can still remember the day, even though it will be years ago now, when we were having a meeting about the journal papers and who was going to do what. And Stephen gifted me the reading comprehension paper. So I was going to write that up and I was going to be the lead author on that. And I'm still very grateful to this day that I feel that was a great honour to be given that paper because it's still other than the one which summarised the whole study, it's the one that got a lot of attention. I think even when you launched the Lancet paper, I came off a plane and went on ITN News Live, probably not looking very great. I got in the studio and they said it's going to be live. I was like, what? But what this shows is a exposure response between aircraft noise at the children's school and their reading score. So the reading score is quite difficult to understand, but obviously lower on that scale is a poorer reading score. And what it showed was that we actually found that reading age was delayed by 1 to 2 months for a 5 decibel change in your noise at school, and that their reading fell below average at around 57 decibels for their school time exposure. And the good thing with Ranch was there's lots of other outcomes as well. We also found some effects on the children's memory. They had higher annoyance, and they also had slightly higher hyperactivity symptoms. And actually, whilst this was published back in 2005, it's still used today in health impact assessments when there's new development and people want to estimate what the impact of that would be on children's learning. And we tried for a long time after that to get people to fund a follow-up study, and people didn't want to fund it. But it's still the question I get asked most today. So it just shows you that actually sometimes when you don't get funding, the question's still there burning in the background. Also had fun. So this is us on a trip to Stockholm. So we're all going to Stockholm again next year, so we could perhaps revisit the ice bar. This always makes me laugh because we all look quite jolly, probably because we're full of vodka. But Stephen's wife never knew he'd been to this ice bar until I showed us at his retirement. It was really good fun, and afterwards, because of what we'd found for children's learning, Heathrow embarked on an intervention scheme. So there was a huge intervention scheme. This is one of their Adobe buildings that they put into some of the children's schools' playgrounds, so the children can go into these spaces and have some quiet whilst they're outside. And again, we tried to get funding to see what the impact would have been using the Ranch methods, but we just never had any luck with that. I think we were still in the stage where people were a bit sceptical about noise having these influences. Ranch led on to ENA, so Stephen and I applied to the EU to lead the European Network on Noise and Health. So back in 2009 to 2011. This is a picture of us all, I think, at the first ENA meeting at St Mary's Paddington at Imperial. See Anna, who's here today, hosting it. There's a few other faces there who are probably still here. And this was a really good, so we were tasked with finding what were the research needs for the European Union for noise for the next, we had 2 years to do it. They actually gave us a little bit longer. And we had 33 partners. And this was real baptism of fire of managing A, EU projects and B, 33 academic partners. But I learned a lot. And we all still work together today. And so what did we come up with in the end? Here's another picture of us at the end. We're looking a bit more tired, perhaps. We're at Bart's, we're at Charterhouse Square here. Stephen and I were lucky enough to work there for many years, and it's very beautiful. And this is actually my 36th birthday. So I know that because I went away on holiday and this date got put in the diary and then I had no choice. But what we found across, it was a huge project. What we decided were the priorities were that we needed more of those exposure response functions across different contexts, different places. We wanted to be able to start to pull findings across studies. So again, needed more studies. At that time, we had very few longitudinal studies, so very little data that actually could put the noise exposure before people's poor health, which is the ideal. We had very few studies of mental health. And back then, I don't know if it's because of the exposure modelling, but most people only looked at noise and we didn't tend to adjust for other exposures like air pollution and things that you might also want to take into account. I won't go through the whole list, but you'll see intervention studies was there. And I think, Stephen, we probably put that in having had difficulty getting anyone to fund us to do one. And you're probably going to see that term again throughout my talk. And so I won't go through all those, but again, that was a really good experience and a huge team. Now, around this time, I started to become more known for my noise and health work. And actually, I was invited working with Stephen Turner and Hilary Notley from DEFRA, Stephen, I think, and I was invited to do the analysis for the UK National Noise Attitude Survey. So that survey was only done every sort of decade or so then, and this was our key way to inform policy as to how people felt about noise, who could hear various sources and how annoyed they were. And then I went on from that. Hilary invited me to be involved in the survey of noise attitudes. And that was really one of my first sort of forays into the sort of the more policy side. I was always making evidence, but this was really like, well, what's evidence for and how are we going to use it? And then around a similar time, another fortuitous event that Bridget Shield put me forward, suggested me for the UK Airport Commission. So we knew the government were going to set up this commission to decide where the next runway should go in the southeast of England. So each airport that wanted to bid for it had to put forward an assessment. And that really then started to expose me to a whole new, what I call tricky questions later on as to where you should build these things, who should get that exposure. And from there I went on, I was on the Independent Commission of Civil Aviation Noise Expert Panel. And I've recently been appointed to the Civil Aviation Authority Environmental Sustainability Panel. So really interesting work where you're trying to balance noise with other environmental exposures and carbon demands and things like that. So around this time, I mean, I haven't even mentioned all the psychiatric epi that I also did with Stephen, but I think he won't be surprised because whilst I liked that, he knows my big passion is noise and health. So around this time, I'd getting a bit bored of teaching. Still like the research, and we hadn't been able to get any longitudinal data, so it was quite difficult for us to get funding or to find databases. So I'd done a lot of work on the 1958 cohort, but we could never persuade them that we could model noise for that and use all that great data, even if it was only just for the past few years. But at that point, I got a really nice opportunity to well, I didn't get an opportunity. I asked to go on sabbatical. And so I was like, I don't want to do the teaching because I ran the abnormal and clinical psychology course. I want to have at least 6 months off. And so my hubby told me, king of negotiation, ask them for more than you want. If you want 6 months, ask them for more than you want. And then when they come back, you can get what you want. So in true Charlotte style, I went in and asked for a year. And they immediately came back and gave me a year. So that's my message about negotiating, is always be bold. You know that, John. And then I was really lucky. I went to work with Hugh Davies at University of British Columbia in Vancouver. They had great health data. Hugh had worked with us on Ranch, and so this was a really nice return favour. So I went there to work on their health insurance data, and I looked at whether living in a noisy neighbourhood increased your chance of developing diabetes. And Vancouver was just fab. So I lived, the top picture is the Fairmont Vancouver Hotel, and I lived in there for about 2 months. And I never made the bed, and I never cooked. And my husband probably say not a lot's changed, but I loved it. I was surrounded by shops. It was just great. And then the wind turbine, Hugh took me up Grouse Mountain for a trip, and you could actually go in the wind turbine. So it had a lift and you can go up the top. And you can only imagine 2 noise researchers in a wind turbine. We were terribly excited. I can't find the pictures though. And I was surrounded by all this great countryside. But I also had another problem because the data had to be analysed in Canada. And so in between shopping and eating out and going up wind turbines, I did a study where we had transportation noise for a huge, it's nearly 400,000 people. So we knew their noise exposure between 1994 and 1998, and then we looked at whether they developed diabetes between 1999 and 2002. It's a bit of a complicated graph, but this was one of my first attempts to look beyond noise. So we also had a whole range of air pollutants, and we also had green space and walkability of people's neighbourhoods. So starting to think about some other factors in the environment as well. So the very top line, that shows you that actually noise was associated with it increased your odds of actually developing incident diabetes. And we also found effects for some of the air pollutants there. And then greenness, that was actually associated with better health. So your chances were reduced of developing that if you lived in a greener neighbourhood. And walkability didn't have an effect. But this was one of the first studies when it was published of environmental noise and diabetes. And actually, there's quite a few of them now. And this approach, which really was led by the UBC team because they'd modelled all these data, this is really the approach we tend to take now. So we would try and add a lot of other exposures in your environment into these analyses to see if noise still has an effect. And so around the time I went on sabbatical, I got the opportunity to get involved with the WHO environmental noise guidelines. So the WHO is hugely influential in the noise world. It published a set of guidelines at the end of the last century, 99, 2000, and they're used everywhere really in a lot of assessments. And Stephen led the revision, which was published in 2018. And as part of that, I undertook 2 systematic reviews. One was on the effect on cognition, so children's learning, and the other was on quality of life, mental health and well-being. And I think we started in 2014. I think I got paid in 2015. I bought a handbag, and then I was still working on it in 2018. So I should have waited to buy the handbag is the lesson there, because it went on and on and on. But very influential, and it's really nice to be known for having done those reviews. And it actually led later for Hilary Notley from DEFRA that we updated the WHO reviews and did another review, another systematic review, possibly with the worst title ever. But yeah, systematic reviewing, those of you who've done it, you know, it sounds like a good idea and it's incredibly painful to do. And the last 10% takes you 5 times as long as the first 90%, I think. But it never stops us, the pain of it. So by this time, we're sort of getting into 2017, and I got more into working on what I refer to as tricky real life issues. And so basically, I now work in a field where there are no easy answers, which is challenging and fun, but also sometimes you just think, oh, I wish it was straightforward. So I went to work at Arup. I left Barts in 2017 and I went to join the acoustics team at Arup. Few of who are here today. So here we are on one of our fabulous away days. Arup always do really good things. If you have an away day, it will be good. If you have a lunch, it will be excellent. So always do it. And I went and I worked with the noise team, feeding in sort of understanding of the research on noise and health. I worked on health impact assessment. So when you want to build, you have to do a health impact assessment saying how you can promote health and prevent poor health. Andrew Baroni here today is one of our leading experts on that. So I did that as well, not as well as Andrew would do it. But on my second day at Arup, I was on a boat in the middle of Tilbury Dock and I was in charge of the Tilbury 2 health impact assessment. So that was quite a learning curve, but also very fun. And the main reason I'd gone to Arup was that Heathrow had got that 3rd runway. They were going to put in a bid to build it. And I thought, if that's going to happen on my watch in my lifetime, and I've done all this work on noise and health, I really want to get involved in that. So I spent a lot of my time, as my ex-colleagues will know, working on Heathrow with them. And I also worked on HS2. And this really introduced me of the quite knotty world of how you assess, how you try and promote health, and how to work incredibly long hours. I mean, Callum and Vivi, who are here, we used to go to the office on a Monday. I probably shouldn't put this on record, should I? We would work till 11. We'd nip out to Lyon for a burger at about 7 o'clock at night. I'd go to a hotel, they'd go home, and we'd do that every day. And then on Friday, I'd go home. And so it was incredibly, there was a huge amount of work to do on it, and it was all really interesting. And the other really interesting thing on Heathrow was that we all got to go out into the community events where they were giving the public information about the scheme. And you just learn so much from being out in those environments of what people think, what their concerns are. And that's really informed my research as well. So what sort of things do I now deal with? Well, and did I deal with at Arup? So things, I still do legal cases on most of these types of questions. So does living near a wind farm have a negative effect on health and quality of life? Increasing opposition against wind farms, wind turbines. When we think about aviation noise, there's been a huge change in the technology, so you can now fly planes far more accurately and on much more direct routes. And I think at least, look at the audience, I don't know how long we've been thinking about this. Should we share the noise out a bit more so that some of you who might not have had the noise before from planes get a little bit? Or should we concentrate it and just have a very few number of flight paths, and then less people are influenced, but those people who are influenced get quite a hefty dose? And I tell you, if any of us have got the answer to that question, that's worth quite a lot, because it's a really tricky issue. Things like, should we have flights at night? Should we newly expose populations? People will always tell you at the events that when they moved there, the noise wasn't there, and now it's there and they don't like it and they chose their house. And these are all really difficult issues for us to deal with. Generally, railway noise has been far less studied, I think it's fair to say. I put the question there, should we build homes on land next to railways? And what I mean by this, don't look horrified, Dave, because he works on HS2. You know those little bits of land that National Rail own next to everything that they build on? Well, I think they're increasingly getting to be quite problematic in terms of the exposure. And then it's all very well to constantly focus on measuring the effects, but we really don't know a lot about how to reduce the impacts noise might have on people's health. So one of the key questions is about whether noise insulation reduces impacts on health and quality of life. And we certainly don't know enough about that. And huge debate that I'll come back to about what the threshold for effects might be. Where do effects begin? So like back in 2000, when people looked at cardiovascular outcomes, they tended to start at 50 decibels and look up and see how the risk went from there. Now we think that wouldn't be the right threshold. We think the effects start lower. So we're also quite keen, and I'll explain why, to start to identify with more certainty where effects begin. So this slide is about it's very simplified, but when the first sort of 10 years of my career, I really was in the top circle here looking at what's the evidence for noise effects on health. And I think that's fair reflection, because I think we did, as I said, still had to convince people that noise was important and that there was a real effect. But we're very lucky in the UK, well, in England, I should say, that we have the noise policy statement for England. And it's a real crack of a read for those of you who are not familiar. I would recommend it. And this sets out actually that you should avoid having adverse effects on noise and health. So that's really good, because we there got a policy that actually mentions the effects that noise can have on health. And it sets these two things which can be hard to understand. So a LOL and a SOL. I won't spell out what they mean, but one is really what's the threshold? Where do we think they begin? And the second is where do we think the effect on health gets really significant? And this example here is from Heathrow. Oh, gone mad now. So this shows you they set a LOL. This is for daytime. This is what they thought if they had 3 runways, the noise exposure would be. and they set a Lowell at 51 decibels for the day, although they didn't set it. That's actually one of the few that's set by policy. And they set a Seoul at 63. And so this map, obviously you get more granularity than this. It's just to show you the sort of the theory that you map that out. You assess how many people, how many households will be exposed, newly exposed to those levels, right? So this is what people don't realise is if you're already exposed, that's not counted in this. It's only really if you've got a change. And then based on that, you do a cost benefit analysis, and then that informs what mitigation you might put in to mitigate and minimise or avoid those effects. I'm sure my Arab colleagues think that's a real potted trot through, but that's just for a general description of how the evidence links to the policy and the assessments that you do. And you can choose where you can, for most things, choose where you set your levels. I won't go into why you can't for aircraft noise. So the really interesting thing about noise is if you decide that mitigation is needed. So if you need to avoid an effect or if you want to mitigate and minimise, there's generally not one solution. So it's not like you've got this exposure, here's the solution. So whenever we think about noise mitigation, it's always going to be generally, for most situations, a combination of things. If we had the quick answer, we'd probably not be here. So this here is from the great review by Lex Brown and Irena van Kamp, which they did for the WHO, which reviewed all the different sorts of interventions you could have and how much evidence we had that they impacted health. So if you did this, the health would improve compared to having the noise and not doing it. And sadly, they found that all the studies there were, but we don't have great evidence here. So there's quite a few things you can do. So the first is to reduce at source. This is where the first one, for those of us who are into fast cars, is not good because this suggests that you actually stop cars being so noisy. Curfews on flights, quieter road surfaces, traffic management. The most common, I think it's fair to say, is what we call path interventions, where you put something between the noise source and the receiver. So it tends to be noise barriers, or that you would get sound insulation in your residence. So things like acoustic glazing. And I think they are the most common ones applied. And as you go, this next one I think is the more challenging. So it's not that common that people build bypasses, terribly expensive. I love this one, move flight paths, because those of us who deal with airspace change know it's just not that simple, and it's particularly not that simple in the southeast. It might work more easily where you've got a huge forest and an airport and you can just change your route slightly or come in over the sea, but that's more challenging. And they also found some on urban planning controls. This is where you would zone areas, but you know that horse has bolted long time ago in the UK. And then within, actually, I think these last few come from the world of EPI and noise and health research. So people have found that when you model noise, if you find people have got a quieter side to their home, they do actually show less of a health impact. So that's something that could be used in urban design, I think, a lot more. And also access to green space. So having access to green space also shown to reduce those effects, but we're still unpacking really how that all works, because not all green space is quiet by default. I think we tend to romantically think if it's a park or it's a green space, it must be quiet, but that's not the case. And so this is another one for you, Eric, to turn away, because I know you don't like this. This was put together by Thomas Munzel just to give a broad overview of how much reduction in decibels you might get for these things. Okay. So electric cars, we often get told, but won't all this road noise disappear because we've got electric cars? Well, actually it won't, because once you're going at 30 miles an hour, all the noise really is coming from your tyres. And so actually having quieter engines really across the fleet is currently estimated to only make a very small difference generally of about 1 to 2 decibels. A noise barrier, Dave will laugh at this, they suggest 10 decibels, but I know when you do these things, it can range massively and you can get more or you can get less than that. It all depends on the context and what you're trying to prevent. Road surfacing, they suggest around 3 to 6 decibels. And look, again, for those of us who like fast cars, reducing the speed limit, not worth it. It's only 1 mile, it's only 1 decibel. Might as well keep your nice cars. Quieter tyres, again, that's not going to look good on the car, 2 to 3 decibels. And then if you have your windows insulated, and there are schemes, there are places where people will insulate your home if you have a certain exposure, particularly around airports. It says you could get up to 10 decibels, but I should think there's actually a much bigger range on how much you could gain from that. And that's because often, you know, housing quality, the context, it all varies. So we don't want anything that stops us having fast cars. So the challenges of taking the evidence and putting it into those assessments is that we really have quite a lot of uncertainty in the noise and health evidence as to where those effects begin, and also to the size of the effects. And this can lead to lots of conflicts between promoters and communities who might want to use different relationships to estimate the effect. And it can actually have quite a big influence on the assessment and the burden of disease that you're counting in if you use different relationships. Although I think we are getting to a point where we always suggest to people, if there's competing evidence, you're probably best to model it, both of them, because at some point the planning inspectorate will ask you what it looks like, so you might as well have done it. Andrew, get back to me on that one. I don't think it's unfair to say that really interventions only get given to those with what we think of as quite high exposure, and always trying to encourage people to offer interventions at lower levels. But we have to have a better understanding of the cost benefits of those decisions. You're not going to get people promoting schemes who are just happy to insulate or do interventions down to lower levels. And we assume all residences have the same indoor and outdoor sound transmission. And again, you could literally have a tombola of numbers and pick one out, and there'll be someone somewhere who says that was the difference between what the exposure was outside and what your exposure was inside. And this becomes quite important because actually we make assumptions. All policy is made really on the outside noise. I should have said that. But actually what your exposure inside might be, we've got less of a good handle on that. And that's an area for us to look into. And then I suppose the big issue, and Andrew, this tries to get a little bit of the question you asked me about. These assessments assume everybody's, well, average, but also that everybody's the same. Okay, so we do an assessment, but we're pretty sure effects would differ across different groups. So, for example, children, social inequality bound to play a role. People have different types of housing as well. People with ill health may be more vulnerable. It might be that you're already chronically ill and that this is another stress and you actually have a bigger response to it. The elderly for the same reason. And then in recent years, we've really focused quite a lot on attitudes to the noise source because this has been shown to be quite an important factor. So one last graph, this is from the Survey of Noise Attitudes in 2014 by the CAA. So this is your summer daytime exposure along the bottom for aircraft noise, and again, high annoyance. And the blue curve in the middle, which is slightly hidden by the pink one, that's just if you plot noise, that's how annoyed people are. But if you look at the other lines, you can see this is whether people would, so the red line is whether you're noise sensitive and whether you expect noise to get worse next year. And you can see that they're far more highly annoyed than the people who, when you just look at noise. And what we're learning is that it really isn't just about the noise, and we tend to only mitigate the noise as well. And so there's a lot of work going into this area of trying to understand what these other factors are that influence it, because just tackling the noise isn't going to solve all of the issues. And there's a lot of work looking at how how communities are dealt with and communicated with around some of these noise sources. So you'll be glad to hear I'm on the home cant. So according to USS, our pension provider, of which I will pass no comment, I will have another 20 more noisy years. So that made me think, oh, wow, what am I going to do? 20 years, that seems, I've already done that. So one thing since I joined George is that I'm very proud of is the Aviation Night Noise and Sleep Study called the ANN study. So this is funded by the Department for Transport, and its aim is to estimate. We realise that when it comes to nighttime noise for aviation, we don't have good exposure response functions for that. And we also have very little understanding of how noise at different times of the night influences people. And that's quite important because the Department for Transport set policy in this area. And if we're to understand and set quotas or not restrictions, but times when aircraft can fly, we really need to have a much better understanding of the impact. And so I'm leading a study along with NatSem, Noise Consultants Limited, and Matthias Basner from the University of Pennsylvania. And it's got two parts. So the first part is a social survey of 4,000 residents who live near 8 UK airports. And they do a survey online, and we ask them about subjective sleep is me asking you how you slept last night, your self-report of your sleep. And we also ask them about annoyance. And then following on from that, we will be doing what we call the objective sleep disturbance study. So we also want to measure people's sleep biologically, physiologically, and so that we can relate that to our aircraft noise events and whether they cause people to wake up. And so Matthias Basner's leading this aspect of it. We borrowed his methodology from the American study, and we're going to have 170 people from the social survey we'll recruit. What happens is this little picture at the top, that's a Pharos Bitten device. This measures your heart rate and your movements, and we can discern your awakenings. We also send you a sound level meter, so you put that on, put this on, and you sleep with it on, and then we will try and correlate the awakenings with the sound events. They'll sleep for a 1 week period with this on. And then in the morning, we ask them again how they slept and subjectively what they think about the night's sleep. So I'm really proud of this study. It's a great team that's really drawn across many of previous projects that I've worked on. And it's actually the first study of sleep and aviation noise for 30 years in the UK. So it's quite a special study. And it's a great team to work with as well. But that's not going to fill 20 years, is it? So what's still left? So we still need some of these things. I went through the recommendations from our noise network from 2011, and I RAG rated them, and actually most of them we still need to do. So that's positive in one way, but not in others. We still need more longitudinal evidence. So we need studies where we can say, this was your exposure for 20 years. This is what happened to your health after that. And we're getting to the point where we will have data sources like that we can use. We also very focus on people's home environments, but we need to think more broadly about the home, the school, the neighbourhood environments. Different times of the day, you know, we still really treat noise as this is your day dose and that's your night dose. And actually there's a lot more granularity in there that we can look at. We still really need studies on most outcomes. So I think cardiometabolic, there's a lot more outcomes that we've totally ignored. Same with cognitive. Mental health is still really the poor cousin. Most people haven't looked at it. And as you've heard about the study of sleep. I think we really need as well, once we've got that evidence, to start doing the health economics on that as well, looking at what the cost to society is for noise exposure. And also if we do those longitudinal, if we get those data sets on the longitudinal side, we can look more at things that are biologically might cause those health outcomes, which we haven't been very good at looking at the mechanisms to date. And we can also try and look at some of these vulnerable groups, so people with certain disorders, children. But I tell you, even in really big studies to look at those vulnerable groups, it sounds very simple, but even massive studies, you still don't often have enough statistical power. So I think we'll still be a little bit in the dark on that. You'll see intervention studies up there. It's still there. 15 years of being noisy and we still haven't done one. But I can't say anything, but I think we'll get some good news on that soon. Fingers crossed. And soundscapes, I haven't said a lot about, but really urban design is, and this whole soundscapes, for those of you who don't know, is all about your whole experience immersed in environments and a more positive take. You know, noise and health, you've got all the Eeyores who are saying this is bad for you, but actually the soundscapes trying to put everything in a context and understand that more broadly and to design better sound environments. So I think it's inevitable that we will get involved in that. Combined sources, we still just treat each noise source on its own. So we do an assessment for air, for road, for rail, and we really don't have a great understanding of what the effects might be for people who've got multiple exposures. And it's quite difficult and complex to do. And again, you can need quite big studies for that. And then I've mentioned outdoor-indoor exposure. I haven't said much about new and neglected sources. So we've been doing work on drones and all these eVTOL. So that's flying taxis to you all about how they might sound. How might people feel about having drones in their neighbourhoods and their environments? Might they be annoyed? At what level? How can we design those? And there's a whole host of other new sources, like heat pumps are going to become very common, and we actually don't know a lot about how people will respond to them. And neglected sources, I think, is the classic, really, railway noise and neighbourhood noise. We really haven't had a good attempt at understanding neighbourhood noise. And it's really complicated, which I think is why we don't do it in many ways, because it's a challenge. So here it is, the last one. Hopefully, I've convinced you that environmental noise is an important public health issue. And I think noise is increasingly seen as not a no threshold effect. So we lag behind air pollution, which is seen in that way now. But I think in time, hopefully, we will be seen in that way. As always, as Rick at Heathrow would tell me, I'm always going to say we need further research, and of course we do. And I think just worth thinking that if we could reduce noise exposure even a little bit, it's got the potential to translate into major long-term public health impacts. And there you are. Thank you for your attention.
So that was excellent. So I'm John Friedland, and the first thing I do is I want to thank Charlotte for a fantastic talk. Really enjoyable. I was going to make various unwitty remarks about whispering, but I won't do that. It was a real tour de force. And in every lecture, you learn lots of things. I learned 4 critical things actually. Then I learned about your negotiation style, which I'd always had an inkling about. I learned about your relationship to parties, very important. And I learned about your great enthusiasm, and I'll come back to that in a minute. And I also learned about why different people have different views of my son's rock band. So I haven't known Charlotte that long, actually, but I first met her through a CV, and I see a lot of CVs. And believe me, when you read a lot of CVs, you think, who the hell's this? The only thing I can tell from this CV is they're probably a bit dull, but that's all I know. But when I read Charlotte's CV, I thought, blimey, this is somebody who really gets things done. This is someone who's not just clever, but they're smart. this is someone who creates impact. This is someone who's a bit different. And that's only when I read a CV. And of course, you've heard just now, all that is true and many times over. So it's a real privilege now to work with Charlotte. And as soon as she was appointed here, she made a big impact. She made a lot of noise, but without making a lot of noise. It was just the way she behaved. Lots of things started to change. Lots of way people thinking started to change. And when we then came to appoint a new director for the Research Institute, PA, Public Health Research Institute, we had applicants of different sorts, and we had some really strong competition, international competition. In fact, the strongest competition was from the USA, in fact. But it was clear that if we wanted things to change, the best person for that was going to be, by miles, Charlotte. And so it's proved that already there are so many things happening in PHRI that it's just great. And she's an excellent colleague. She's got a great sense of humour. She's a great person to have a conversation with about almost anything. And I want to thank you very much indeed for showing us how you've been noisy, why you've been noisy, and how great all that is. And the last 20 years have been great. I think the next 20 years are going to be even more of a ball. And so I just want you to really, once again, if you're online, you have to do this metaphorically, but we assume you're doing it. And if you're in the room, give Charlotte another big round of applause. And just in case you didn't hear what Jenny said at the beginning, the next stop is no questions. Well, you can ask Charlotte a question in a minute. You have to go around the corner. It's about 10 meters maybe for a drink and a bit of a nibble in the collaboration space, as we call it, just around there. So please all come round now. So I'm looking forward to tomorrow. You better come in. You're the main person.
My part, your part.